Picture this. You're trapped at the absolute bottom of the ocean. The water around you is incredibly heavy, dark, and murky, and it's filled with this creeping, visceral sense of dread.
Right, just a total nightmare scenario.
Exactly. But you aren't swimming. You're standing inside this fragile, fully glass, tube-shaped room. And outside this glass, in that crushing, freezing darkness, a massive school of giant whale sharks is swimming past.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and suddenly, one of them stops.
Yeah.
It turns to you. Its face alone is the size of 50 people. It stares directly into your eyes, and without opening its mouth, a voice echoes inside your head. It's warning you. It tells you that the glass you were standing behind is going to break.
That is just, I mean, it's terrifying.
It is. And just as you try to run, you freeze. You wake up in your own bed gasping. But the nightmare isn't over. You're awake, but you can still feel invisible hands violently shaking the left side of your body.
Yeah, it is a profoundly unsettling image, right? And what makes this particular case study so striking isn't just the surreal cinematic imagery.
Right.
It's the intense, lingering physical sensation that followed the dreamer right out of the sleep state, dragging that terror into their waking reality. The boundary between the mind's internal theater and the body's physical nervous system completely dissolved.
Completely shattered. And that dissolution of the boundary is basically the mission for our deep dive today. We were going to unpack this exact, highly detailed dream submitted in our source material. And we aren't just going to, interpret it like some kind of parlor trick, pulling vague meanings out of a hat.
No, not at all.
We're going to analyze this experience through two completely different, yet incredibly intersecting lenses. On one side, we have the deep, archetypal psychological symbolism pioneered by Carl Jung. And on the other, the hard, cutting-edge neuroscience of sleep physiology.
Which is where things get truly illuminating, I think.
We are looking at the exact intersection of abstract psychological terror and hardwired neurological phenomena.
Yeah, because we often, we dismiss dreams as just random noise, just the brain sorting through the day's garbage.
Right, like, oh, I ate spicy food before bed.
Exactly. But when we analyze a case study that's structurally complex, we uncover an architecture that is incredibly purposeful. It is a highly organized, desperate attempt by the unconscious to communicate a very specific, urgent message to the waking self.
So for everyone listening right now, even if you have never dreamt of a giant telepathic fish in your life, your brain is doing this too. Your mind is constantly constructing these elaborate, bizarre, symbolic narratives, and sometimes generating physical sensations, to warn you about hidden dangers in your own waking life.
It's happening all the time, whether we remember it or not.
Exactly. Today, we are going to decode exactly how your mind builds these intricate emergency alarm systems and why they sometimes glitch into your waking reality. So let's jump in. To begin breaking down this architecture, we have to start with the setting.
The environment.
Right? Before we get to the giant sharks or the sleep paralysis, we need to look at where this is happening. Because in dream analysis, the environment represents the architecture of the dreamer's mind at that exact moment. And here we are at the bottom of the deep sea.
The setting is absolutely foundational here. In psychological terms, particularly within the Jungian framework we're discussing today, the sea represents the state of the mind itself.
Okay.
So if you think about the surface of the water, that represents our conscious, everyday awareness. The part of you that answers emails, makes coffee, navigates traffic.
The day-to-day stuff.
Right. But this dream takes place in the deep sea, a profound, sunless depth. And this represents the deepest levels of the unconscious. Specifically, it points toward what Jung called the collective unconscious.
Okay, so I've heard the term collective unconscious, but it always sounded a bit, I don't know, mystical to me, almost like a shared psychic Wi-Fi network that we're all tapped into.
A lot of people think of it that way, yeah.
Let's break that down without the jargon. What actually is it?
Well, it helps to think of it less as magic and more as evolutionary psychology. The collective unconscious is essentially an inherited database of human experiences.
An inherited database.
Yeah, just as our physical bodies have inherited certain biological structures over millions of years of evolution, Jung argued that our minds have inherited universal psychological structures.
Oh, interesting. So like hardwired instincts.
Exactly. Deep-seated instincts, primal fears, fundamental human narratives like the fear of the dark or the concept of a mother figure or the instinct to flee a predator.
Things every human just kind of implicitly understands.
In the waking world, our rational ego cannot easily access this deep database. It's too buried. But in our dreams, we plunge right into it.
And it's definitely not a pleasant scuba diving trip in this specific dream. The source material notes that the ambiance is incredibly dark, thin, and creeping. Like there is a palpable terror to the water itself.
That ambient terror is a direct reflection of the dreamer's internal state. The physical pressure of the deep ocean in the dream perfectly mirrors the extreme psychological pressure building up in their waking world.
So the water pressure is literally life pressure.
Yes. We are looking at an environment of severe hidden anxiety and unseen fears about the future. The weight of miles of ocean water pressing down is the weight of whatever crisis this person is facing in their daily life.
But they aren't just floating out in the open water, which is the weird part. They are inside a very specific structure, a fully glass, tube-shaped room. And the source notes there are just a couple of sofas inside, spaced far apart. I find this detail
It's
fascinating.
very specific, isn't it?
It is. If your brain wants to protect you from the crushing pressure of the deep sea, why build a room out of glass?
Well, the choice of material is a brilliant visualization of a psychological concept. In this framework, the glass room represents a highly developed, rational ego defense mechanism.
A defense mechanism.
Yeah. When we face overwhelming stress, the crushing pressure of that deep, dark ocean, the conscious mind has to build a shelter to survive. It constructs a barrier between itself and the trauma.
To keep the water out.
Exactly. But the fact that the barrier is glass reveals the dual nature of this specific defense.
Because it's transparent.
Yeah.
It lets you see the threat without touching it. I mean, it reminds me of people who use extreme intellectualization as a shield.
That's the perfect example.
Like saying, I know my job is destroying my mental health, I can clearly see all the toxic dynamics playing out around me, and I can explain the psychological feelings of my boss in perfect detail. Therefore, I am safe from the damage.
Yes, that is the exact mechanism at play here. Intellectualization allows you to observe the trauma rather than feel it. The glass tube allows the dreamer to look out into the dark ocean to see the monsters in the dark, but from a safe, seemingly objective distance.
You're just watching it like a movie.
Right, you feel insulated because you have placed a transparent barrier of logic between you and the anxiety. But the crucial point the source material emphasizes, and the terrifying reality of the dream, is that glass is inherently fragile.
It shatters. So it's like sitting in a shark cage made of sugar glass.
Sugar glass, yeah.
You think you're being logical and safe by analyzing your problems from behind this barrier. But the barrier itself is fundamentally unsuited for the immense pressure of the environment.
The sugar glass analogy perfectly captures the vulnerability of the ego here. The ego is trying to maintain intellectual control in an environment where it is vastly overpowered by raw emotion and stress.
It's outmatched.
Completely outmatched. So the warning in the dream that the glass is going to crack is a critical signal from the subconscious. It is a prophecy of imminent collapse.
Wow.
The sources suggest this points to a coming breakdown in the waking world. It could be a collapse of self-esteem, a total failure of their coping strategies, or a severe breakdown in real-world relationships. The intellectual pressure is simply too great for this fragile defense to hold.
So if you're listening to this, think about the glass tubes you might be building in your own life right now. Are you truly dealing with your stress, or are you just staring at it through a window, hoping the glass holds?
It's a tough question to ask yourself.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because that raises a really scary question. If this glass tube is how your brain keeps the darkness at bay, what actually happens to the person's mind when the glass breaks? Like, what does that look like in reality?
The source describes it as the muddy stream of the unconscious violently rushing in to swallow the ego.
That sounds intense.
It is. In waking life, it represents a state where you're no longer able to maintain that cool, detached, objective distance. The anxiety, fear, or anger that you were just passively analyzing suddenly overwhelms you.
So you drown in it.
You become consumed by the very emotions you were trying to intellectualize. It is a complete psychological flooding. This is why the warning in the dream isn't just an observation.
It's a directive.
Exactly. The dreamer is told they must move to the non-glass room next door or escape quickly.
The non-glass room. It sounds so mundane compared to everything else, but it implies a completely different psychological architecture, like a solid wall instead of a transparent one.
Yeah, it is a psychological directive to abandon avoidant coping mechanisms. You can no longer rely on just observing your problems.
Right.
Moving to the non-glass room means adopting a more grounded, robust, and realistic way of dealing with waking pressures, even if it means you can no longer see everything with perfect, detached clarity.
You have to give up the illusion of control. Which brings us to the messenger. Because now that we know how precarious this classroom is and how close the dreamer is to a psychological implosion, we need to understand who is delivering this warning.
The entity outside.
Yeah, the entity outside the glass tube is a massive school of giant whale sharks. Now, my first instinct, if I see a shark in a dream, is to assume it's just a classic nightmare monster, a predator trying to eat me.
Sure, and the source material addresses that common assumption. Typically, sharks in dreams are categorized as symbols of uncontrollable anger, overwhelming anxiety, or an impending crisis.
The classic Jaws scenario.
Right. They usually represent a predatory threat that the ego is desperately trying to outswim.
But these aren't great whites or tiger sharks. These are whale sharks. Gentle giants. Filter feeders. I mean, they have no teeth to tear you apart.
Yeah.
And the specific whale shark that stops to interact with the dreamer is impossibly large.
Enormous.
The dreamer notes that the face of this creature alone was the size of 50 humans.
The scale and the species shift the entire psychological paradigm of the dream here. This isn't a predator attacking the glass. It is a massive, non-aggressive presence making direct eye contact.
And it communicates telepathically, delivering the warning about the glass cracking and the need to move to the non-glass room.
Right.
But I'm struggling to wrap my head around a telepathic 50-person-sized fish as a helpful messenger. How does Jungian analysis categorize something that bizarre?
Within the broader Jungian framework, this creature represents a very specific, powerful archetype, the wise old man or the self.
Okay, when I hear wise old man, I immediately picture Gandalf or Dumbledore, like a literal old man with a long beard, not a marine animal.
A lot of people do, but it's a metaphorical term for a specific psychological function. The archetype of the wise old man doesn't have to take human form.
Okay.
It represents a source of transcendent wisdom, an internal guiding force that possesses a deep, holistic understanding of what the psyche needs to survive and integrate.
So this giant sea creature is a projection of the dreamer's own deepest internal wisdom, bubbling up from that collective unconscious we discussed earlier.
Yes, exactly.
So it's basically the dreamer's own brain talking to them, trying to save them from their own denial. But let's look at the mechanics of that. If my brain knows I'm in danger, why wouldn't it just make me realize that while I'm awake?
That's the core question, isn't it?
Right, like why go through this entire theatrical production with the deep sea, the crushing pressure, and the telepathic giant fish? Why not just give me a conscious thought that says, hey, your coping mechanism isn't working?
That touches on a core psychological mechanism mentioned in the text, which is compensatory action or self-regulation. To understand why the brain uses this theatrical production, we have to look at how different parts of our mind fail to communicate with each other.
Okay, I'm with you.
Think about the waking ego, the part of the dreamer currently trapped in that glass tube of denial. In waking life, this ego is actively filtering out the danger. It is using its intellect to tell itself, I am fine, everything is fine, I have this entirely under control.
It's building the glass.
Exactly. The conscious mind is heavily defended by language and logical thought.
So if the subconscious just sent up a subtle, logical signal, like a mild feeling of unease or a passing thought that a habit is unhealthy, the waking ego would just rationalize it away.
Precisely. The ego would use language to defeat the warning. It would say, I'm just tired today, or work is just busy, and ignore it.
So the waking ego is using the very tools of logic and language to build the fragile glass room. Therefore, language and logic will not work to tear it down.
Exactly. The unconscious has to bypass the linguistic filters of the left brain entirely. To compensate for this dangerous level of conscious denial, the unconscious must summon an undeniable, overwhelming surge of raw psychological energy.
It has to create a spectacle so massive, it breaks the ego's ability to rationalize it. A face the size of 50 people, I mean, you can't argue with that. It commands absolute awe.
Awe is the exact intended mechanism. By using an archaic, overwhelming symbol, like a giant telepathic creature from the deep, the unconscious bypasses the rational defenses completely.
Because there's no logic to apply to it.
Right. The nonverbal telepathic nature of the communication is a direct end run around the ego's linguistic roadblocks. It strikes directly at the core of the dreamer's emotional awareness, forcing them to pay attention.
Oh.
The dynamic of compensatory action dictates that the more the conscious mind denies a truth, the more exaggerated and massive the unconscious symbol must become to forcefully restore psychological balance.
It's like the brain pulling the ultimate trump card. I am going to manifest something so unbelievably massive that your tiny little rational ego is forced into submission.
That's a great way to put it.
And apparently, the intervention works. The dreamer gets this profound, undeniable warning. They understand the glass is going to break, and they know they have to escape to the non-glass room.
Mm-hmm.
So the obvious question is, why don't they just run out the door? What stops them from acting on this immense wisdom?
That dilemma introduces the next layer of the dream's architecture, and it involves the other characters in the room, because the dreamer is not alone in the glass tube.
Right. This leads us to the brother and the sofa. Which sounds absurd, but in the context of this dream, it becomes a terrifying trap.
It really does.
So inside this glass room, the dreamer is with their brother, but the brother is stuck behind one of the sofas. The dreamer tries to warn him, saying, hey, these giant sharks are trying to send us a message, the glass is breaking. But the brother shows absolutely zero interest. He completely ignores the existential threat.
He just doesn't care.
Yeah. And then, when the dreamer decides to just grab the brother and run, the dreamer ends up getting stuck behind the other sofa.
Yeah.
And they're completely paralyzed.
This specific sequence is a masterclass in how the mind visualizes internal conflict. To decode it, we really need to understand what the brother and the sofa represent. Let's start with the brother. According to the Jungian framework in our sources, the brother in this scenario represents the shadow.
The shadow. People usually throw that term around to mean the dark, evil parts of themselves, like the villain hiding inside.
Yeah, that is a very common oversimplification. The shadow isn't necessarily evil. It represents the innate, unlived, and repressed aspects of the self.
Okay.
It contains everything that the conscious ego refuses to acknowledge, accept, or integrate about itself. It can contain anger and selfishness, yes, but it can also contain unexpressed creativity, vulnerability, or, in this specific case, profound apathy.
Let me push back on that for a second, because dreams often use our daily residue, right?
Sure.
Could the brother in the dream just represent, I don't know, their actual real-life brother? Maybe they just had an argument in waking life, and the dreamer is frustrated that the brother never listens to their advice. Why jump straight to it being a repressed part of the dreamer's own psyche?
It is a totally logical question, and real-life dynamics certainly do bleed into dreams. However, the Jungian rule of thumb highlighted in our material provides a crucial distinction. In dream analysis, same-sex siblings or close same-sex friends almost invariably act as personifications of the shadow.
Oh, really?
Yes, they act as internal mirrors rather than representations of the external people. So the conflict happening in the glass room is an internal war projected onto the familiar face of a sibling.
So we have to look at the brother's behavior as a reflection of the dreamer. The brother is apathetic, he's stuck behind a sofa, he is completely ignoring a massive literal shark warning.
Exactly. That behavior reflects the dreamer's own deeply repressed desire to ignore reality. It is the part of the dreamer that wants to just give up, shut down, and passively sink into the status quo, even when they know that status quo is dangerous.
If you think about your own life, how many times have you known exactly what you needed to do to fix a toxic situation? Maybe quitting a job or ending a bad relationship. But instead of taking action, you found yourself just lying on the couch, scrolling through your phone, completely paralyzed by apathy.
We've all been there.
That is the shadow at work. The conscious part of the dreamer is terrified and wants to escape, driven by the whale shark's warning. But there's this heavy, repressed part of their own personality that just wants to lay down and ignore the impending collapse.
And the brilliance of the dream is how it spatially represents this internal conflict through the furniture, the sofa.
Right. Getting stuck behind a sofa is such a mundane detail in the middle of this epic, underwater psychological thriller. But it grounds the terror in something so familiar.
It carries a profound symbolic weight because it subverts our expectations. Traditionally, a sofa is a symbol of rest, relaxation, and domestic safety. It's a place of comfort. But the dream turns this symbol entirely upside down.
Because they aren't on it.
Right. The dreamer and the brother don't sit on the sofa to relax, they get stuck behind it.
The comfort becomes a cage. The desire for rest and safety has morphed into a psychological prison.
Exactly. The defense mechanism of retreating to comfort has become paralyzing. The spatial arrangement creates what psychologists call an approach avoidance conflict, or a double bind.
The double bind.
Yeah. The conscious mind, having received the message from the wise old man archetype, is desperate to move towards safety. The instinct for survival is demanding movement. But the shadow, the internal apathy, the fear of the unknown, wants to stay hidden behind the false comfort of the sofa. These two immense psychological forces collide.
And when two opposing forces of equal strength collide, you get complete mental gridlock. The energy required to escape cancels out the energy required to hide.
Leaving the dreamer completely frozen. The physical paralysis behind the sofa is the literal manifestation of this internal war. They are physically frozen in the dream because they are psychologically gridlocked in their waking life. The tension between knowing what they must do and the terror of actually doing it has peaked.
Which is terrifying on a psychological level.
Yeah.
But the source material notes something even more disturbing. This paralysis didn't stop when the dream ended.
No, they did.
The metaphor literally became a biological reality. The dreamer is frozen behind the sofa, and then they wake up. But the physical paralysis and a very specific set of tactile sensations actually followed them into the waking world.
Yes.
We're crossing the boundary here, moving from Jungian psychology directly into modern neurobiology and sleep physiology.
This transition is where the case study bridges the gap between the abstract mind and the biological brain. The psychological stress of the double bind was so acute that it literally spilled over into the physical nervous system.
So let's lay out exactly what the source material says happened when the dreamer opened their eyes. Upon waking, the dreamer felt like they were physically trapped in the fabric of the sofa. But more intensely, they felt a vivid, undeniable sensation of being violently shaken on the left side of their body.
Right.
They're safely in bed, totally alone, with nothing actually touching them, but their body is registering a physical assault. How does the brain manufacture physical touch out of a psychological nightmare?
To understand the mechanics of this, we really have to look deep into the brainstem and the architecture of REM sleep. Specifically, a neurobiological phenomenon known as REM sleep atonia.
Atonia. Let's break that down. Atonia, a lack of muscle tone, meaning paralysis.
Exactly. When you enter REM sleep, which stands for rapid eye movement, the phase where these highly vivid, emotional, and narrative-driven dreams occur, your brain actively paralyzes your major voluntary muscle groups.
Why would evolution design our bodies to paralyze themselves every single night?
Well, it is a highly evolved protective mechanism. During REM sleep, your motor cortex is firing wildly as you run, fight, or swim in your dreams.
Because the brain thinks it's real.
Right. If those signals reached your muscles, you would physically act out your dreams, potentially injuring yourself or your sleeping partner.
That would be a disaster.
It would. So to prevent this, specific clusters of neurons in the brain stem primarily in the pons and medulla release inhibitory neurotransmitters, mainly GABA and glycine.
GABA and glycine.
Yes. These neurotransmitters travel down the spinal cord and actively block the motor neurons from firing. Your brain is highly active, experiencing a vivid reality, but your physical body is locked down in a chemical straitjacket.
So under normal circumstances, when my alarm goes off, the brain stops releasing those inhibitory chemicals and I wake up and stretch.
Under normal circumstances, the timeline of waking up is seamless. The switch flips. The brain transitions out of REM, consciousness returns to the prefrontal cortex, and in the exact same millisecond, the supply of GABA and glycine is cut off, restoring motor control. The paralysis lifts as the dream fades.
But that seamless transition failed completely for our dreamer.
It failed catastrophically. Under extreme psychological stress, severe fatigue, or when a nightmare reaches an intolerable peak of terror, the brain's timing mechanisms can fracture. You get what the text describes as a phase mismatch.
A phase mismatch. I'm picturing like a car where the driver slams on the gas, but the transmission is still lock and park. The engine is roaring, but nothing is connecting properly.
That is a very accurate mechanical analogy. The psychological terror in the dream, the realization that the glass was breaking combined with the inescapable double bind of being trapped behind the sofa caused such an intense spike in the brain's threat detection circuitry that it forced an emergency awakening.
The amygdala essentially pulled the fire alarm to get the dreamer out of danger.
Exactly. But the brain pulled the fire alarm before it had time to unlock the physical doors of the body.
Wow.
The dreamer's consciousness woke up, their eyes opened, the prefrontal cortex started to boot up, but the neurochemicals maintaining that REM sleep atonia, the GABA and glycine in the spinal cord, hadn't cleared out yet.
They were still active.
Yes. They were fully awake and aware of their bedroom, but their body was still chemically paralyzed. This terrifying transitional state between sleep and waking is called the hypnopompic state.
Okay, I always get this confused with the hypnagogic state. Let's clarify the difference for the listener.
It is easy to confuse, for sure. Hypnagogic refers to the transitional state when you are falling asleep, going into the dream world.
Like when you suddenly jerk awake right as you're drifting off.
Right. Hypnopompic, on the other hand, refers to the transition of waking up, coming out of the dream world. And when you are stuck in a hypnopompic state with a phase mismatch, you are highly susceptible to hypnopompic hallucinations.
Which explains the phantom shaking. The brain is trying to make sense of the sensory chaos.
Yes. The brain's prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for logical reality checking, the part that should look around the bedroom and conclude, I am awake, I am safe, this is just a dream, wasn't fully online yet. But the neural engine generating the nightmare was still running at full capacity.
It's still churning out the fear.
Exactly. The intense sensory and emotional signals generated by the dream were still feeding directly into the brain's somatosensory cortex.
The somatosensory cortex, that's the strip of the brain that maps out your physical body and processes touch, pressure, and pain.
Because the prefrontal cortex couldn't vet the incoming signals and dismiss them as dream data, the somatosensory cortex processed these lingering neurological signals as real, physical touch occurring in the present moment.
It manufactured phantom tactile sensations.
Yes. The feeling of being physically stuck in the sofa fabric, the violent feeling of being shaken, it is a physiological patchwork state. A glitch in the matrix where the raw data of the dream literally bleeds into the waking sensory reality.
Going back to our computer analogies, it's like a computer doing a hard reboot. The hardware is trying to start up the waking operating system, but one of the background monitors is still displaying the horror movie from the previous user session, and the speakers are still blasting the audio. The brain is caught halfway between two completely different physiological realities.
The overlap of those realities is what causes the profound terror associated with sleep paralysis. But what elevates this specific case study from a standard episode of sleep paralysis to a fascinating neurological puzzle is the detail regarding where the phantom shaking occurred.
Yes. The source notes the phantom shaking was entirely on the left side of the body. The invisible hands were only grabbing their left shoulder and arm. I originally wrote this off as just a random, meaningless dream detail, but the source links it to brain lateralization. I'm a bit lost on the causality there, though. How does the emotional content of a nightmare dictate which side of your physical body hallucinates upon waking?
It is a remarkable piece of evidence that points to how different parts of the brain manage different tasks. The brain is divided into two hemispheres, left and right.
Right, and broadly speaking, popular science usually tells us the left brain handles logic, math, and language, while the right brain handles emotion, art, and spatial awareness.
While that is a slightly oversimplified view of neuroscience, it provides a very useful framework here. The source emphasizes two crucial functions of the right hemisphere. First, it is heavily involved in processing complex spatial awareness and intense emotional intuition.
Okay, spatial and emotional.
Second, and this is the key mechanical piece, due to the decussation or crossing over of nerve fibers in the medulla oblongata at the base of the brain, the right hemisphere controls the sensory input and motor output for the left side of the body.
Okay, let me make sure I follow the physical wiring here. Right brain equals left body. Left brain equals right body.
Correct. Now, analyze the nature of this specific dream through that lens. Consider what the brain was being asked to process. It was a highly spatial scenario.
Evaluating the depth of the ocean. Mapping the dimensions of the glass tube.
Yes, calculating the distance to the non-glass room, grasping the impossible 50-person scale of the giant whale shark, and feeling the physical entrapment of the body behind the sofa.
That is a massive amount of spatial geometry for the brain to render.
And layered on top of that spatial rendering, it was a highly emotional scenario, infused with profound dread, the awe of the wise old man archetype, and the paralyzing internal conflict with the shadow.
Which means the right hemisphere of the brain, the side responsible for all that spatial mapping and heavy emotional lifting, was working in absolute overdrive during this nightmare. It was burning hot.
Because the right hemisphere was so hyperactive, processing all this intense, complex data, it took slightly longer to shut down its dream generation processes. It lingered in the REM sleep state just a fraction of a second longer than the logical, language-processing left hemisphere.
So they got out of sync.
The two halves of the brain fell completely out of sync.
So the left brain woke up, assessed the environment, and said, okay, logic dictates we are in a bed. But the right brain was still screaming, we are trapped behind a sofa under the ocean and the glass is breaking.
And because that hyperactive right hemisphere is hardwired to the left side of the body, those lingering, frantic dream signals manifested as a physical, tactile hallucination specifically on the left side.
Wow.
The residual shaking sensation wasn't random at all. It was a direct neurological footprint of the right brain's delayed transition out of REM sleep due to the sheer volume of spatial and emotional processing it was handling.
The mechanics of that are astonishing. If we pull all these threads together, The psychological stress of the double bind, the desperate need to escape the breaking glass versus the shadow's paralyzing apathy, hit such a critical threshold that the brain couldn't contain the conflict in the abstract dream state anymore.
It boiled over.
It forced a physiological awakening to escape the psychological trap, but the biological system crashed during the emergency reboot, resulting in this terrifying half-awake hallucination.
It goes beyond just a fascinating nightmare. It perfectly demonstrates how acute psychological stress or trauma becomes somatic.
Somatic meaning it manifests in the physical flesh and blood of the body.
The stress of the mind fundamentally disrupts the autonomic nervous system. The unresolved conflict in the psyche becomes literal suffering in the body. Which brings us to the ultimate purpose of this deep dive, the final synthesis of the psychological and the neurological.
Right.
We have dissected the deep-sea symbolism, we've broken down the neurochemistry of the waking hallucinations, but a warning system is only useful if you actually heed the warning. What does the dreamer actually do with all this information?
Right, because the source material is very clear that this dream is not a minor suggestion. It is a severe, high-level system failure warning. The psychological stress is so intense it's manifesting physically, disrupting their sleep architecture. So what is the actionable takeaway here? How do they escape the glass tube in their actual waking life?
Well, the first non-negotiable step is recognition. The dreamer must identify the fragile situation in their real life that correlates to the glass room. They need to locate where they are employing this intellectualized defense mechanism.
Where are they pretending to be objective and detached while secretly being crushed by pressure?
Exactly. Is it a toxic workplace they are rationalizing staying in? A failing relationship they are analyzing instead of leaving? A self-destructive habit they have convinced themselves they have under control?
They have to look at their life and find the sugar glass cage. They have to admit that the barrier they think is keeping them safe is actually about to shatter and let the ocean in.
Acknowledgement is the absolute prerequisite for survival here. But finding the glass room isn't enough to escape it. The brilliance of the dream architecture is that it provides very specific instructions on how to navigate the escape, largely by showing the dreamer exactly what not to do.
And what not to do is get stuck behind the sofa arguing with the brother.
The sources emphasize this as the crux of the psychological integration. The dreamer must not waste their limited energy trying to convince the brother.
Right.
Remember, the brother represents the shadow, their own internal apathy, their deep-seated fear of change, their desire to just lay down and maintain the dangerous status quo.
Which is incredibly counterintuitive for how we usually approach self-help or personal growth. Normally, if we recognize a part of ourselves as depressed, scared, or apathetic, we spend all our energy trying to fix that specific part first. We journal about it. We try to talk ourselves out of being afraid. We try to negotiate with our shadow before we take any real-world action.
And the dream violently illustrates exactly what happens when you adopt that strategy. You get stuck behind the furniture. If you wait until your fear of change completely disappears before you act, if you wait until the apathetic part of you is fully convinced to move, you will be paralyzed behind the sofa while the glass breaks and the ocean crushes you both.
The internal argument is a trap designed to prevent action.
It is a complete trap.
So the dream is literally instructing them. Stop arguing with the guy stuck behind the sofa. You cannot reason with the shadow right now. Just leave him there and walk through the door.
That is the essence of psychological integration in this context. The very presence of the wise old man archetype, the giant whale shark, proves that the dreamer already possesses incredible internal resilience and self-healing energy.
The capacity is there.
The deepest part of their unconscious knows exactly how to fix the problem and has delivered the solution.
And the whale shark's instruction was explicit. Move to the non-glass room next door.
The solution requires a physical, definitive action in the real world. It means abandoning the facade of what the source calls objective endurance.
Right, objective endurance.
You cannot just tough it out by observing your trauma intellectually. You have to make a concrete environmental or relational change. You have to change your physical or social reality.
You have to actually act. You have to quit the job. You have to end the relationship. You have to ask for help.
True integration doesn't mean eliminating the shadow. You will always have parts of your psyche that are afraid, apathetic, or resistant to change. Integration means refusing to let that internal paralysis dictate your conscious choices.
It's the old adage that action must precede the feeling of readiness. You can't wait to feel brave in order to act bravely. You have to run to the non-glass room, even while your shadow is screaming at you to stay hidden, even while you were terrified of the sharks outside.
The conscious ego must take the lead, guided by the deep, primal intuition of the whale shark, and physically step out of the fragile environment before it collapses entirely.
Wow.
Only through that definitive action in the waking world can the immense psychological pressure be released, allowing the nervous system to finally recalibrate, ending the somatic symptoms and allowing the mind to rest.
We have covered a massive expanse of territory today. I mean, we started at the terrifying, murky depths of the collective unconscious, examining the primal fears we all inherit. We analyzed the fragile, transparent walls of our own ego defenses, those glass tubes we build to convince ourselves we can outthink our own trauma.
We really went through it all.
We came face to face with the awe-inspiring telepathic wisdom of the whale shark, a symbol of our mind's desperate, overwhelming attempt to save us from our own logical denial. We explored how easily we can get trapped by our own shadow, paralyzed by the false comfort of the sofa in an approach avoidance conflict.
And the biology of it.
Yes, and finally, we crashed headfirst into the hard biology of the waking brain, exploring the neurochemistry of REM atonia, brain lateralization, and how the horror of a mental trap can force a physiological glitch, leaving us hallucinating phantom hands in the dark.
It is a profound journey, tracing a single sequence of sleep from abstract archetypal symbol all the way down to the neurochemical reality of the brainstem. It shows how deeply intertwined our psychological health is with our physical neurology.
It brings us back to why unpacking this specific case study matters to everyone listening. Because the architecture of this dream is the architecture of the human mind. We all build glass tubes to protect ourselves from the immense, crushing pressures of our waking lives. We convince ourselves that as long as we can clearly see the sharks swimming around us, as long as we can articulate our stress and intellectualize our trauma, we are somehow safe from its impact.
But we aren't.
Exactly. But I want you to think about your own life right now. Look at the structures you rely on to cope with the pressure at work, in your relationships, in your own head. Are you truly safe? Or are you just observing your own anxiety from inside a fragile bubble, arguing with your own shadow behind the sofa while the water pressure builds? Your mind has an incredible, deeply wired alarm system designed to keep you alive, utilizing the deepest wisdom of your unconscious and the complex neurochemistry of your brain. But that alarm system only works if you have the courage to pay attention and take action. Listen closely to what your mind is telling you before the glass begins to crack. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of dreams.